Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Chapter 1. The Bennets' New Neighbour. It is a truth well known to all the world that an unmarried man in possession of a large fortune must be in need of a wife. And when such a man moves into a neighbourhood, even if nothing is known about his feelings or opinions, this truth is so clear to the surrounding families that they think of him immediately as the future husband of one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband one day, "have you heard that someone is going to rent Netherfield Park at last?" "No, Mrs. Bennet, I haven't," said her husband. "Don't you want to know who is renting it?" cried Mrs. Bennet impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I don't mind listening." Mrs. Bennet needed no further encouragement. "Well, my dear, I hear that he's a very rich young man from the north of England. It seems he came to see Netherfield on Monday, and was so delighted with it that he arranged to rent it at once. Of course, it is the finest house in the area, with the largest gardens. His servants will be here by the end of the week, and he will be arriving soon afterwards." "What is his name?" asked Mr. Bennet. "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, of course. A single man of large fortune. He has an income of £4,000 or £5,000 a year. How wonderful for our girls!" "Why? How can it affect them?" Mr. Bennet asked. "My dear Mr. Bennet," she replied, "how can you be so annoying? You must realise I'm thinking of his marrying one of our daughters." "Is that his purpose in coming to the area?" "His purpose? No, of course not. But it's very likely that he'll fall in love with one of them. And I want him to see the girls as soon as possible, before our other neighbours introduce themselves. So you must visit him as soon as he arrives." "I really don't see why I should," said Mr. Bennet. "You and the girls can visit him. Or perhaps you should send them by themselves. Yes, that might be better, as you're as attractive as any of them, and Mr. Bingley might like you best." "Oh, my dear, you flatter me," replied his wife. "I certainly have been called beautiful in the past, but I think a woman with 5 adult daughters should stop thinking of her own beauty. Mr. Bennet, I beg you to visit him. You know it's correct for the gentleman of the family to visit new neighbours first. I simply cannot take the girls to see him unless you have already met him." "Surely you worry too much about the rules of polite society. I'm sure Mr. Bingley will be delighted to see you all, and I'll write him a few lines, which you can give him, agreeing gladly to his marrying any of the girls, although I must especially recommend my dear little Lizzie." "Oh, no, Mr. Bennet," gasped Mrs. Bennet, horrified. "Please don't do that. And Lizzie is no better than the others, although I know she is your favourite." "Our daughters are all very silly, ignorant girls, it's true, but at least Lizzie is a little more intelligent than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you speak so unkindly of your own children? Oh, dear, how ill I feel. Have you no pity for me? Don't you realise how I suffer?" "Indeed, my dear, I've suffered with you for the last 23 years, but I think you will recover and live to see many more rich young men come into the neighbourhood." When he was young, Mr. Bennet had made the mistake of falling in love with a pretty but foolish young woman. During the long years of their marriage, he had had time to regret his mistake. He soon realised that his wife had little intelligence or common sense, and was only interested in talking, shopping, and finding husbands for her daughters. His experience had made him rather bitter, and he could not stop himself mocking his wife, who never understood her husband's sense of humour. So, when, a week later, Mrs. Bennet discovered that her husband had in fact visited Mr. Bingley at Netherfield, she was surprised and very pleased. But she and her daughters tried in vain to persuade Mr. Bennet to describe the wealthy stranger, and in the end they had to rely on another neighbour's description,
He sounds wonderful, Mamma,
cried Lydia, the youngest and noisiest of the sisters.
Charlotte Lucas's father has been to see him and says he's quite young, very handsome and extremely charming. And even better, he loves dancing. Everybody knows that means he's very likely to fall in love.
As politeness required, Mr. Bingley came to visit Mr. Bennet a few days later. He was not, however, fortunate enough to see the Bennet girls, who were hiding behind the curtains in an upstairs room in order to catch sight of the handsome stranger. Mrs. Bennet planned to invite him to dinner, but in fact they met him at another social event first. The Bennets lived in the small Hertfordshire village of Longbourn, and public dances were regularly held in the nearest town, Meryton. The girls were greatly looking forward to this particular dance, because they had heard that Mr. Bingley would be attending with a group of friends from London. On the night of the dance, all eyes were on Mr. Bingley as he entered the room. He had brought his two sisters, with the husband of the elder, Mr. Hurst, and another young man, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley was indeed good-looking and gentlemanlike, and his sisters were fine, fashionable women. However, everybody was soon talking about Mr. Darcy, a tall, handsome man, who, it was said, had an income of £10,000 a year. The ladies in the room gazed at him in admiration for about half the evening, until they became aware of his constant frown and his unwillingness to talk or dance. Then there was general agreement that he was proud and disagreeable, and considered himself superior to country people. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, made himself popular with the ladies by dancing every dance and talking to everybody. As there were not as many gentlemen as ladies, Elizabeth Bennet did not have a partner for one of the dances, and was sitting watching the dancing. Mr. Darcy was standing near her, and when Mr. Bingley came up to speak to his friend, Elizabeth could not avoid hearing their conversation. "Come, Darcy," said Bingley, "I hate to see you looking so cross. Why don't you dance with one of these lovely girls?" "Certainly not," replied Darcy. "You know how I hate dancing with a partner I don't know. I would particularly dislike it at a village dance like this. Apart from your sisters, there isn't a woman in the room I would even consider dancing with. You were dancing with the only attractive girl here." He was looking at Mrs. Bennet's eldest daughter, Jane, who was waiting for Bingley to join her for the next dance. "Oh, yes, she's the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. But just behind you is one of her sisters. She's very pretty, and I'm sure she's very pleasant. My partner could introduce you." "Who do you mean?" And Darcy turned to look at Elizabeth for a moment. "No," he said coldly. "She's not attractive enough to tempt me. Go back to your partner, Bingley." This conversation did not endear Mr. Darcy to Elizabeth, but she told the story very cheerfully and amusingly to her friends. The evening passed very happily for everybody else, and Mrs. Bennet was delighted with the effect her eldest daughter had had on Mr. Bingley. "He danced with Jane twice," she told her husband later. "He danced with all the others only once. And he really is so handsome. But his friend, Mr. Darcy, was so rude to poor Elizabeth. Luckily she doesn't care. She wouldn't want to please him. Such a horrible, proud man. I simply hate him." When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, they discussed their dancing partners.
"I was really very flattered when Mr. Bingley asked me to dance a second time," said Jane, blushing. "I didn't expect it at all."
"Didn't you?" said Elizabeth. "I did. Dear Jane, you were 5 times prettier than any other woman in the room, but you're too modest ever to expect admiration."
"I have to admit that I liked Mr. Bingley," continued Jane in her gentle voice. "He's so good-mannered and agreeable."
"He's also handsome," added her sister, "which makes his character quite perfect. But what did you think of his sisters?"
"Very pleasant when you get to know them. The younger, Miss Caroline Bingley, will be living at Netherfield with her brother. I'm sure we'll enjoy having her as a neighbour."
Elizabeth listened in silence. She was not convinced. Jane is so kind, she thought, always ready to see the good side of people's characters. I considered Mr. Bingley's sisters too proud, almost rude, in fact. I'm sure they feel superior to most other people, like Mr. Darcy. But she did not say any more. After the dance, the Bennet and Bingley families began to visit each other every few days. It became evident that Mr. Bingley admired Jane very much, and Elizabeth knew that her sister was close to falling in love with him. She was discussing this with her good friend Charlotte Lucas one day. Charlotte was a sensible, intelligent young woman of 27, the eldest daughter of Sir William and Lady Lucas, who were neighbours of the Bennet family. "It's a good thing," said Elizabeth, "that if Jane is in love with Mr. Bingley, nobody will know, because she always behaves so cheerfully and normally." "That's sometimes a mistake," replied Charlotte, shaking her head wisely. "If she doesn't show her feelings at all, even to the man she loves, she may lose the opportunity of catching him. Jane should use every moment she gets with Bingley to attract and encourage him." "But I consider a man should try to discover a woman's feelings, not wait for her encouragement. And Jane probably doesn't know what her real feelings for Bingley are yet. She has only seen him a few times, not often enough to understand his character, or be sure that she really loves him." "Well, I wish Jane success with all my heart," said Charlotte finally. "But I think she'd have as much chance of happiness if she married him tomorrow as if she studied his character for a whole year. Happiness in marriage is simply a question of chance. I think it's better to know as little as possible about the person you're going to spend your life with." Elizabeth laughed, sure that Charlotte did not mean what she was saying. While observing Mr. Bingley's interest in Jane, however, Elizabeth had not noticed Mr. Darcy's interest in herself. Although at first he had not even considered her pretty, he now began to realise what a beautiful expression her dark eyes gave to her intelligent face, and what an attractive figure she had. "Of course, she is only an unfashionable village girl," he told himself, "but her conversation is often quite amusing." Whenever they met, he did not speak to her, but stood near her, listening to her and watching her closely, conscious of a wish to know her better. One evening, at a party at the Lucases' house, Darcy was standing alone, as usual, away from the other guests, watching the dancing. His host, Sir William, came to speak to him. "Mr. Darcy, are you enjoying the dancing, sir? What a delightful entertainment it is." Darcy frowned. "Yes," he said with cool disdain. "It's something that any uneducated person can be good at." "I'm sure you're good at dancing yourself, sir," replied Sir William cheerfully. "Look, here's Miss Elizabeth Bennet." She was crossing the room at that moment. "Let me persuade you to dance with her. You cannot refuse to dance when so much beauty is in front of you." "Indeed, sir," replied Elizabeth quickly in some embarrassment. "I have no intention of dancing. You must excuse me." "Miss Bennet, please allow me the pleasure of dancing with you," said Mr. Darcy politely, holding out his hand. But with equal politeness, Elizabeth refused again, and turned away. Mr. Darcy was watching her walk away, with a slight smile on his face, when Caroline Bingley came up to him.
"Mr. Darcy," she said, "I'm sure I know what you're thinking. How boring all these silly little country people are."
"Not at all, Miss Bingley. In fact, I was just thinking what pleasure a pair of fine eyes can give."
"Really? And who do these fine eyes belong to, may I ask?"
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet."
"Well, let me be the first to congratulate you, Mr. Darcy. When will the wedding be?"
"Ah, that's what I expected you to say. A lady's imagination jumps from admiration to love to marriage in a moment."
"Well, of course, when you're married, you will often have her charming mother and sisters to stay. How delightful for you!"
And Miss Bingley, seeing that Darcy remained calm, continued to mock the Bennet family as amusingly as she could. Chapter 2. Jane's illness. Mr. Bennet had a comfortable income of £2,000 a year and a pleasant house in Longbourn. But unfortunately for his daughters, after his death, all his property would pass to a distant male relation. Mrs. Bennet's father had been a lawyer and had only left his daughter a small amount of money. She had a brother who owned shops in London, and she also had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips. He had been her father's clerk and now carried on his late employer's business. Mr. and Mrs. Phillips lived in Meryton, which was only a kilometre or so from the village of Longbourn. It was a most convenient distance for the Bennet girls, who were usually tempted there 3 or 4 times a week to visit their aunt or a dressmaker who lived opposite. The youngest daughters, Kitty and Lydia, were particularly regular visitors. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', and if no better entertainment was available, a walk to Meryton always provided some amusement, as well as interesting local news from their aunt. The latest news, which delighted Kitty and Lydia, was that the regiment, which had recently arrived in Meryton, was to stay there for the whole winter. The 2 girls now visited their aunt every day, and as Mr. Phillips knew all the officers, Kitty and Lydia were soon introduced to them. At home, they could talk of nothing but officers and their handsome uniforms. Even Mr. Bingley's fortune now seemed hardly worth considering. After listening to their praise of the officers one morning, Mr. Bennet said coolly, "From what I can see, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country. I've suspected it for some time, but now I'm convinced." Kitty was embarrassed and did not reply, but Lydia, the youngest, continued to express her admiration for a certain Captain Carter with perfect indifference. "I am very surprised, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. As it happens, they are all very clever." "That is the only point, I think, on which we do not agree. I am afraid I must say that I consider our 2 youngest daughters unusually foolish." "My dear Mr. Bennet, you mustn't expect such young girls to have the common sense of their father or mother. I remember when I used to like a red coat myself, and indeed I still do. If a good-looking officer with 5,000 or 6,000 a year wanted to marry one of my girls, I wouldn't turn him down. And I thought Colonel Forster looked very handsome last night at Sir William's in his regimental uniform." Just then, a servant entered with a note for Jane, which had come from Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet's eyes shone with pleasure, and she called out eagerly while her daughter was reading it, "Well, Jane, who is it from? What does he say? Tell us quickly, my love."
"It's from Miss Bingley," said Jane. "She invites me to dinner at Netherfield, as she and her sister are alone. It seems her brother and the gentleman are having dinner with the officers in Meryton." "With the officers?" cried Lydia. "I wonder why Aunt Phillips didn't tell us that."
"Having dinner in Meryton?" repeated Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head. "That's very unlucky." "May I take the carriage?" asked Jane. "No, my dear. You'd better ride over there, because it looks likely to rain, and then you'll have to stay the night." "That would be a good plan," said Elizabeth to her mother, "if you were sure they wouldn't offer to send her home in their carriage." "Oh, but they can't. The gentleman must have taken Mr. Bingley's carriage to go to Meryton." "I'd much rather go in the carriage," Jane said. "But, my dear, your father can't spare the horses, I'm sure. They're needed on the farm, aren't they, Mr. Bennet?" Mr. Bennet finally agreed that they were, in fact, being used that day in the fields. So Jane set out on her horse, while her mother called cheerfully after her, "I do hope it'll rain heavily, my love." And Jane had not been gone for long before it rained hard. Elizabeth was a little worried about her sister, but Mrs. Bennet was delighted. "What a good idea of mine that was," she said more than once, extremely pleased with herself. Not until the next morning, however, did she realize the full extent of her success. After breakfast, a servant from Netherfield arrived with a note from Jane to Elizabeth, explaining that Jane had caught cold on her wet ride and had been invited to stay at Netherfield until she recovered. "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, "if your daughter should become seriously ill and die, it would be a comfort to know that she died in a good cause and in obedience to your orders."
"Oh, I'm not afraid of her dying. People don't die of colds. She'll be looked after well at Netherfield. As long as she stays there, everything will be all right."
But Elizabeth felt really anxious and was determined to go to her sister. As the carriage was not available and she was not keen on riding, she decided to walk the 5 kilometres to Netherfield. Kitty and Lydia accompanied her as far as Meryton, where they went to visit one of the officers' wives. Elizabeth continued alone, crossing field after field and jumping impatiently over streams in her anxiety to see her sister. When she arrived at Netherfield, with tired feet, muddy stockings, and a face healthily pink with exercise, she was shown straight into the sitting-room. The two sisters, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, could hardly believe that she had come so far alone and on foot in such bad weather, but they received her politely. Their brother, however, was more than polite. He was kind and considerate towards her. Mr. Darcy said very little, hesitating between admiration of her healthy good looks and doubt whether she should have come such a distance alone. Mr. Hurst said nothing at all, as he was thinking only of his breakfast. Elizabeth was glad to be taken almost immediately to her sister's room, where she found Jane delighted to see her, but very feverish and unwell. The doctor came, and after examining his patient, advised that she should stay in bed and take some medicine. Elizabeth stayed with her all day, looking after her, and the Bingley sisters also spent some time in the patient's room. However, in the afternoon, when it was time for Elizabeth to leave, Jane seemed so upset that Miss Bingley was obliged to invite Elizabeth to stay at Netherfield for the present, and a servant was sent to Longbourn to inform the Bennet family and bring back some clothes. That evening, Elizabeth went down to dinner, leaving Jane in bed in her room. She noticed the Bingley sisters' apparent concern for Jane changed to indifference in a few moments, and knew she had been right to dislike them at first sight. Mr. Bingley, indeed, was the only one of the group whose behaviour she was satisfied with. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his politeness towards herself most pleasing. But the others, she felt, treated her as an unwelcome guest. Miss Bingley was concentrating all her attention on Mr. Darcy, and Mrs. Hurst also joined in their conversation, while Mr. Hurst was only interested in eating, drinking, and playing cards. When Elizabeth left the room after dinner to see if Jane needed anything, Miss Bingley at once began to criticise her.
"What bad manners she has! She's both proud and lacking in politeness to her superiors. She has no conversation, no elegance, and no beauty."
Mrs. Hurst agreed and added,
"She has no good qualities, except that she's an excellent walker. I'll never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. How silly of her to come at all. Why must she run around the countryside just because her sister has a cold? Her hair looked so untidy, and her dress simply covered in mud."
"I must say," said Bingley, "I didn't notice any of that. I thought she looked remarkably attractive when she arrived this morning."
"You observed her wild appearance, I'm sure, Mr. Darcy," said Miss Bingley. "And I imagine you wouldn't wish your sister to make such a show of herself."
"Certainly not."
"Walking 4 or 5 kilometres, whatever it was, up to her ankles in mud, and alone, quite alone. It seems to me to show a dreadful sort of independence, a country girl's indifference to what is acceptable."
"I think it shows a very pleasing affection for her sister," said Bingley.
"I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy," whispered Miss Bingley, "that this adventure has rather lessened your admiration of her fine eyes."
"Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." After a short pause, Mrs. Hurst began again. I have a great liking for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well married. But with such a father and mother, and with such vulgar relations, I'm afraid there's no chance of it.
I think the Bennet girls have an uncle who's a lawyer in Meryton.
Yes, and they have another who owns shops in Cheapside. Such a nice part of London. Both the sisters laughed. If they had enough uncles to fill Cheapside, cried Bingley, it wouldn't make them any less charming. But it must considerably lessen their chances of marrying men of any position in the world, replied Darcy. Bingley did not answer, but his sisters agreed enthusiastically, and continued mocking their dear friend's vulgar relations for some time. Late in the evening, when Elizabeth was satisfied that Jane was asleep, she felt she ought to go downstairs again. She found the party in the sitting-room playing cards, but although they invited her to join in their game, she refused politely and picked up a book to read. "I can fetch you more books to read if you wish," offered Bingley, "but I'm afraid I haven't got a large library. Unlike you, I'm too lazy to spend much time reading."
"What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy," said Miss Bingley. "And what a beautiful house it is. Charles, when you buy your house, I hope it will be even half as lovely as Pemberley."
"I hope so too," agreed Bingley.
"And your dear sister, Mr. Darcy. I expect she's grown since the spring. I want so much to see her again. I've never met anyone who delighted me so much. Such an appearance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age."
"I'm always surprised," said Bingley, "to find how very accomplished all young ladies are. How do they have the time and patience to learn all these skills?" "Certainly people use the word accomplished too loosely," said Darcy. "But I am far from agreeing with you about ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than 6 who are really accomplished." "Then," said Elizabeth, "your idea of an accomplished woman must include a great many qualities." "Yes, a great many."
"Oh, certainly,"
cried his faithful assistant, Miss Bingley.
"An accomplished woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages. And besides this, a certain something in her manner of walking, in her voice, and in her behaviour."
"All this she must possess," added Darcy, "and something more solid, the improvement of her mind by wide reading." "I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women," said Elizabeth. "I rather wonder at your knowing any. I've never seen such elegance and intelligence and knowledge as you describe in one woman." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley were both protesting loudly that they knew many women like this, when Mr. Hurst called their attention back to the card game. As this meant an end to the conversation, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room.
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet," said Miss Bingley to Darcy, "is one of those women who try to appear attractive to men by undervaluing other women. I think that's a mean trick."
"It is true," said Darcy, "that there is meanness in all the tricks used by ladies to attract men." Miss Bingley was not satisfied enough with this answer to continue the conversation. The next morning, Elizabeth was glad to be able to inform Mr. Bingley and his sisters that Jane was very much better. In spite of this improvement, however, she asked for her mother to be sent for, as she wanted Mrs. Bennet's opinion of Jane's state of health. Soon after breakfast, therefore, Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her 2 youngest daughters, reached Netherfield. Elizabeth, although relieved to hear that her mother did not think Jane's illness serious, began to regret asking her to come when she saw the Bingley sisters smiling at Mrs. Bennet's remarks. Elizabeth blushed for her mother, who could not help showing her lack of intelligence and common sense in everything she said. Kitty and Lydia made an equally bad impression. They had been whispering together when suddenly Lydia, who was an attractive, confident, well-grown girl of 15, pushed herself rudely forward. She begged Mr. Bingley to hold a ball at Netherfield. With his usual politeness, Mr. Bingley promised he would, but Elizabeth saw his sisters exchanging meaningful glances. She was quite glad when her mother and sisters left. She and Jane were to stay another night at Netherfield to allow Jane to recover completely. That evening, Elizabeth appeared again in the sitting-room. She could not avoid noticing how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. But as she felt sure that so great a man could not possibly admire her, she assumed that when he looked at her, he was criticising her in some way. This thought did not cause her any pain, as she liked him too little to care for his approval. In the conversation she had with him, she spoke in her usual slightly mocking manner, rather expecting to offend him, but was surprised by the quiet politeness of his replies. Darcy had never before been so charmed by any woman. He really believed that if she did not have such vulgar relations, he might be in danger of falling in love with her. Miss Bingley saw or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane was increased by her wish to get rid of Elizabeth. Fortunately, perhaps, for almost everyone at Netherfield, Elizabeth and her sister, who was now quite recovered, were returning home the next day. Only Mr. Bingley showed real sorrow at this, and was concerned that Jane might not be fit enough to travel. Mr. Darcy was quite relieved, and determined that no sign of admiration for Elizabeth should escape him now. Miss Bingley's politeness to Elizabeth, as well as her affection for Jane, increased rapidly as the moment of departure approached, and she was able to say good-bye to them with many warm expressions of friendliness and a promise to visit them very soon. Mr. Bennet was glad to welcome his eldest daughters home again, as he had felt their absence from the family circle. But Mrs. Bennet, who had hoped they would stay much longer, was quite disappointed to see them come back in such a short time. Chapter 3. Mr. Collins visits Longbourn. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife at breakfast the next morning, "that you have told the cook to send up a good dinner today, as I am expecting a visitor."
"Who is it, my dear? I know of nobody who is coming, unless Charlotte Lucas happens to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her."
"The person I'm talking about is a gentleman and a stranger." Mrs. Bennet's eyes shone with excitement.
"It's Mr. Bingley, I'm sure. Why, Jane, you never mentioned it. Well, I'll be extremely glad to see him. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to the cook at once."
"It is not Mr. Bingley," said her husband. "It's a person whom I have never seen before." This caused general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters all at the same time. Having amused himself for some time with their curiosity, he finally explained. "I have recently received a letter from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, as you know, will inherit all my property when I die, and may throw you out of this house as soon as he wants."
"Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "please don't mention that hateful man. It's the hardest thing in the world to accept the fact that your property is not left to your own children, and I'm sure, if I were you, I'd have tried to do something about it."
Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain the legal situation to her again. They had often attempted to do this before, but it was a matter which Mrs. Bennet refused to understand, and she continued to complain bitterly about Mr. Collins. "It certainly is most unjust," agreed Mr. Bennet, "and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting this house. But if you listen while I read his letter to you, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself." He read aloud the following letter. "Dear Sir, the disagreement between you and my late respected father always worried me, and since his death I have frequently wished to improve the relationship between our families. After a long period of study and training, I have recently become a priest, and have been fortunate enough to gain the patronage of Lady Catherine de Burgh, widow of Sir Lewis de Burgh. This generous lady has given me the post of rector at Hunsford, which was luckily vacant. Hunsford is the village near her own large country house in Kent. Here I carry out the duties of my profession whenever necessary, and I take great care to behave at all times with grateful respect towards her ladyship. As a priest, moreover, I feel it my duty to encourage all families in my area of influence to live peacefully. Because of this, I flatter myself that I am acting correctly in offering you my friendship. I am, of course, concerned that when I eventually inherit all your property, your daughters will doubtless be very poor, and I do apologize for this. I promise you I am ready to make amends in every possible way, but more about this later. If you do not object, I propose to visit you and your family on Monday, November the 18th at 4 o'clock, and shall probably stay until the following Saturday week. This will cause me no inconvenience at all, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence from my duties. I remain, dear sir, with respectful good wishes to your lady and your daughters, your friend, William Collins.
So we can expect this peacemaking gentleman at 4 o'clock today,
said Mr. Bennet as he folded up the letter.
He appears to be a most polite and serious young man. How considerate of Lady Catherine to allow him to visit us.
Well, if he is ready to make amends to the girls in some way, I shall certainly not discourage him, said Mrs. Bennet. Although it's difficult, said Jane, to guess how he intends to do that. It's good of him to want to help us. I think he's peculiar, said Elizabeth. He sounds too pleased with himself, and he speaks so politely of Lady Catherine. And why does he apologise for inheriting father's property in future? We know it's not his fault. Can he be a sensible man, sir? She added, turning to Mr. Bennet.
No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the opposite. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises to be entertaining. I am impatient to see him.
Mary, the middle daughter, who spent most of her time reading and who seldom joined in family conversation, now remarked that in her opinion his letter was well expressed. But Kitty and Lydia did not show any interest in the letter or its writer. As it was highly unlikely that their cousin would arrive in a regimental uniform, they could not imagine having any pleasure in meeting him. Their mother, however, had changed her attitude towards Mr. Collins after his letter, and was now preparing to meet him with such calmness that it astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins arrived punctually, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins did not seem in need of encouragement. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His expression was serious and his manners very formal. Soon after his arrival, he said to Mrs. Bennet,
"Madam, I must compliment you on having such a fine family of daughters. I had heard much of their beauty, but I find them even more beautiful than reports have stated. I do not doubt you will see them all well married quite soon."
Mrs. Bennet never quarrelled with compliments, and she answered,
"You are very kind, sir, and indeed I do hope so, because otherwise they'll have nothing at all to live on." "You refer, perhaps, to my inheriting the Bennet property?"
"Ah, yes, sir, I do. You must confess it is a sad business for my poor girls."
"I am very aware, madam, of the hardship to your lovely daughters, and could say more about this, but I am cautious of saying too much too soon.